What the I'm looking at a corner of the ceiling. Now I see the top of your head.
Hello. Let me get set up.
Okay.
Mr. Bluetooth. Boom. All right.
How you doing? Long time no see.
Yeah, I'm doing good.
How has this class been going? Purely electronically. What's that?
Um, I think for me it's been pretty easy because I think the best part of it is I'm able to organize most of the stuff like in files, so that way, like example, I have like week ones, week twos, week threes, and all that like separated on like a Google Drive. So that's been pretty easy for me to organize. Every once in a while, there's a bit of a workload, but besides that, it's been going pretty good so far.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it adds a lot to the workload to have to either you don't see videos on what I'm doing, or you watch the videos and then I don't know how interesting they are and they're long, you know.
No, they're pretty good, but and like some of them, like when they're PowerPoints, also like I can just like browse through it, and then I just listen to like the commentary that you give every once in a while. Also,
Yeah, when I just post a PowerPoint, are you getting what you need from that, or do I need to lecture over it?
um, I think the lectures help most of all because like the PowerPoints just kind of summarize the main idea, but you add more context into it. So.
Yeah. Did you see the one, any of the ones I've done on the final exam?
I saw the one on week 12. I started getting into that. So
Okay.
I saw the slideshow.
Yeah, so the one, Noe, would you say that the one we just did on Tuesday was maybe the most useful?
Uh, was that the one on I Am Vain?
Well, we've done I'm vain kind of over and over, but I got into transparency, what I mean by, I mean, these are obviously just words in the English language, right? But I get into what I mean by, like, when I'm going to say on the exam, look for examples of context. What do I mean by that for the purpose of the exam, you know? Or what do I mean by transparency?
Oh
Um,
yeah, I think you made that pretty clear during that last Zoom session, like transparency in terms of like examples of it and stuff.
yeah. So
Yeah.
Noah, yeah, welcome. We were just saying that that in the last video I put up, I kind of make sure we're on the same page of like when I say on the final. And you know what I'll do is I did a student reminded me that I did this last year, so in fact I'll do it this year. It's open book, like like I did for the midterm. And you know what? I'll as soon as I can post it, I'll invite you guys to Zoom sessions so that if you have questions in real time, you can ask about those. Um, so I'm scrambling to get both all of your feedback for this class updated and get a final exam. You know, I create a kind of a brand new final exam every semester for this class because, you know, what I'm looking at is my head is hurting, but I've been looking at anti-vaxxer and QAnon posts, like the actual real stuff, not the writing that you find about it in the New York Times or whatever, but the actual videos and posts. Um, and the problem is that either the stuff is so ridiculous that I don't know how to ask you a question about how to apply some actual news literacy skills to track it down, because they'll say things like, oh, it's the new world order, global conspiracy. They'll just say that right there, which I think you know kind of lets you know right there, like maybe not. Or it's like some 45-minute long, hyper detailed deep dive into some rabbit hole where I just wouldn't want to wish that on my worst enemy, let alone on my students, to ask you to analyze something like that. So I'm trying to find the perfect sweet spot of something that involves some real critical thinking and you know, maybe even a little bit of investigative skills, or certainly your news literacy skills, to be able to say, okay, right here is clearly where we know there's a problem. It's just in reality, you know, reality is always messier than, you know, the examples we want to use in the classroom, right? So to the extent that if you guys find anything like that, like this week as an assignment by Sunday, I asked you guys to find one on your own or to apply it, and I gave you a bunch of links to get started. I actually have some more that I can add to that. Um, but you know, that if you guys find one, a lot of times it's going to be better if it's just like a little tweet. Like if it's a 45-minute video, even if I'm saying go to minute 15, 20 seconds in or whatever it is, that's still going to create confusion among some students for the final, right? They'll go to the wrong time stamp, or they'll get confused. So ideally it'd be something like just something short, like a tweet, and a really narrow, specific question of like, what's the problem with this? You know, using what you know about I'm vain or lateral reading or whatever. How are you alerted to that? So, but I guess what I'm suggesting is the sooner I can get the final exam up, I'd like to give you guys 2 full weeks to get it done. But that means, you know, by the time you're turning in this homework on Sunday, I've got already the final exam ready, and that's kind of a tall order for me because it takes a lot of work to put it together. But ideally, I'll have it up by like say Monday or Tuesday, and then that way next week for our Zoom sessions, what we can do is we can go over the final exam together and check it out. But I will recommend that you guys look at, if you're going to look at any video to like really pay attention to, maybe look at the one we did this last Tuesday, because like, just to share my screen and show you what I'm talking about. These are the terms that I said, you know, let's get familiar with this week. So hold on. Well, like these ones right here. Correlation versus does not equal causation. We talk about that on Tuesday. Direct versus indirect evidence, all of these. And I know that they, like I said, I know that these just mean things in the English language, but you know, when I ask you about them on the exam, I'm being specific, and I want to be sure that we're all on the same page so you know how to answer them correctly. Okay. Let's see. So what I wanted to cover today, if it's all right, is the essay questions. And again, this is more like I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you all, and this is more, you know, this is my stuff. It's not Stony Brook. It's not I'm vain stuff. This is where I kind of use my knowledge of history, and it's a discussion more about media. And I'm asking you guys to just communicate with me that you have a basic understanding of what I'm talking about. So why don't I present some of this, and then, you know, I'll pause wherever possible so that I can bring you guys into the conversation about it. Okay. Okay, and so basically what I want to do is make 20% of the exam about propaganda, disinformation, and this whole idea of like how companies like um, Facebook and Twitter and YouTube actually regulate the media. Um, and so they're going to be, there's 2 parts to the questions you're going to answer. 2 questions are required questions, okay? And those are, explain some of the parallels between problems we faced with the media today and the problems we faced with the media from the First World War through the 1920s, okay? So First World War was between 1914 and, basically ended in 1918. And then the second question is, what were some of the concerns about the power of media, or what we call media effects, back then, and what are some of the concerns now? And then so you have to answer both of those, and then you have to choose 2 of the 4 of these questions. So any 2 of these 4. Explain connections past and present between private industry and government in developing propaganda and disinformation. What was proposed in the 20s for self-regulation of the media? Explain strengths and weaknesses of proposed solutions for today, and offer your own suggestions for social media and news sites. How do you understand objectivity, and what concerns have scholars raised about the traditional notion of objectivity? What do you think? So like, what are some of the basic problems with objectivity that we've discussed, right? And then finally, explain 3 principles of pragmatic objectivity and how this concept differs from the idea of traditional objectivity. Could this be useful as a standard for news organizations and platforms that provide news today? So those are my essay questions. I mean, the one thing that I'm still trying to parse out or figure out is that, I really would have, I just feel like I can only ask so much of you for the final exam, but I really would have liked to have wrapped up the movie profiles. And we really didn't do anything with the journalist profiles. It was just turned out to be too much. So although, I'm going to give extra credit for the people who completed that. But, I would have liked maybe another essay question, and maybe I'll do it as extra credit on just something to wrap up all the discussions we've had about movies and representations of journalists in popular culture. But hopefully you guys got a lot out of that. Let me pause for a second before we dive any further. And Luna, did you get any kind of a takeaway from the movies you watched this semester and the discussions we've had showing the representations of journalists?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the most interesting things about that was seeing what different types of journalists were shown in the different movies. And then it was also interesting seeing the different ways in which the public handles it, and how some of the more higher ups kind of use journalists to their advantage or try to like swerve away from it. So it just shows different points of views of journalists, and I think that's definitely interesting to worry about, because it shows us an example of like what to do, how to be a journalist, and what to avoid when being a journalist.
Yeah, did any of you guys want to add to what he just said there?
I mean, for me, the movie's definitely like the main takeaway that I had from that most of the movie shared was just kind of what he was saying at the end, with just the nitty gritty of what it is like to be a journalist, because we go through the the news literacy of it, which is, I know, literally the whole thing of this class, and just things to be aware of in terms of literacy and just intake of media and things like that. And I know in 200 we go into also the the different types of journalism and all that, but the actual parts of the job are things that, and I'm not saying that movies are like completely accurate about that. A lot of it is dramatized, but it gives you some idea of the kinds of physical, like structural obstacles you have, or some of the things you have to do. So like Woodward and Bernstein having to chase a million leads and having their anonymous source, and just things on the job that definitely we don't have the capacity to discuss in this class without such examples.
Are all 3 of you guys who are majors, can you share with me, has it affected in any way the way you imagine yourself as journalists once you graduate?
I definitely think, if anything, it just kind of pushes me, at least, definitely more to be a journalist. So that way, because I think the main issue right now is that there's too much like dishonesty in the media, and seeing these movies and definitely learning about like the different like codes and like opening the fridge, that kind of terminology is definitely pushes me more to follow the major, if anything.
And Luke, you know, you're an ACM major. So has this affected either the way you look at journalism or what you want to do? Like, have the movies affected your own ambitions about what you want to do professionally?
Mm, I don't think this semester has proven to show me what I want to do with my life, but I guess, I mean, with watching the movies, I do like have a better understanding of not really evaluating the movies or like analyzing them, but just kind of understanding like the media and the way it works. And I have been able to make some connections to like the film industry, but I wouldn't say it's super overwhelming, but I definitely have been able to connect things from this class to my ACM class.
What do you want to do as a filmmaker? Because it's interesting to me. You're like, nah, not really. You
Well, I
know,
think I talked about this before. I want to make an independent film about climate change. Um,
but you don't see yourself as a journalist in doing that.
mm, Not necessarily, because I'm not really like the best writer. So I think I express myself a lot better through photography and videography. So they definitely would like play a part in one another, but I guess like under the umbrella of journalism, I don't think I would see myself going that way.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, I have an ongoing debate with our documentary filmmaker about whether what he does is journalism. And we do like a year and a half of video in our program. Were you aware of that, Luke?
No, I wasn't.
Yeah, we do a year and a half of video work. Like, so you do a 330 course just on video, and then you do a fall senior year and a spring senior year. And Noah's in my multimedia class, so he can tell you that the way that I design the photography and the sound assignments in multimedia is as an introduction to video. Um,
Okay. I
I
didn't
just
know that.
don't teach video in that class because we cover so many different media. You know, we also cover design in that class, but we spend like 4 weeks on photography, and then about 4 weeks on audio. Which, if you know from video, audio, some people say 80% of video is audio. Um,
Hmm.
so so I think there's a legitimate debate about, what's journalism, what's not journalism. I mean, no matter what I say to Scott Schimmel, who's the documentary filmmaker, he just does not see himself as a journalist. He has his own idea in his head of what that word means, which is different than what the word means to me. But I think there's a lot of overlap between, say, documentary filmmaking and journalism. So it's all kind of just how you choose to look at it, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's very true.
Yeah. Okay. Let me get into then these questions one at a time. So the first question is of the essay stuff. Explain some of the parallels between the problems we face today and the problems faced with media from the World War I through the 20s. Now, before I get to the next slide, just as a way to make this less a lecture and more of a discussion with you all, you guys, from our past discussions and readings, have some familiarity with where I'm going with this. Does anything jump to mind about what people were encountering in 1915, 1918, and what we're encountering now, and where there are similarities?
Would it be propaganda?
Yeah, that would definitely be one. Any thoughts? Should I just keep going? Let me keep going. I think you guys are, are you gonna say something, Luna? I guess.
No. I think I was gonna say also just how easy it is for like disinformation to get spread out because of technology today. I think that's an issue facing now.
Right. So I guess what I'd say is, that's true. Maybe let's step back and just, be clear about what was happening in 1915 so that you guys can see, in a broad sense, you had new technology, right? And the simplest way for you guys to understand this is that this was basically what you had coinciding with World War I, like 1914 to 1918, was the birth of mass communication. Okay. Now, what do I mean by mass communication, y'all? Like, how would you define mass communication?
At the risk of being a little too late, I'd say radio.
Yep, radio. And it's not too late, because radio by then, well, we'll get into each of these media, but what else? What else was part of the birth of mass communication? Luke, you should be up on this. You're not sure what I mean?
Mass communication?
Yeah. What was going on in this era that was part of the birth of mass communication? The birth of film, right?
Well, I think that was when films were more than black and white and silent, I think, right?
Not quite yet. No, not by 1914 to 1918. But you have to think, imagine being alive. Well, we'll deal with each of these things respectively. Let's maybe stay on the broad one. But film is being born. Let's leave it at that while we're at this slide, okay? And what else is part of the birth of mass communication in this era? Is TV there yet? 1915, 1914, 1915?
No, I think it
Not
came
quite
until
yet.
like the 30s, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, it's still like really just an invention by the 30s. I mean, by the 40s, by the early 40s, when World War II is going on, I was surprised to learn that there were some TVs in some households during the actual war. But you never think of World War II. You never think of people seeing that on a television set, right? You really didn't have TV until the very end of the 40s, starting to appear in people's living rooms, and really not until the 50s. So if we're talking 1915, we're still quite a long ways away from television, right? But you guys nailed radio. You understand that film is just being born. And then what else would be mass communication? Well, this one probably wouldn't be as obvious to you guys, but if you remember, we've talked so much this semester about the advance of printing technology, and the fact that, if you were to go back 100 years from, 1915 to 1815, in 1815, they're still cranking hand presses by hand, right? By the 1830s, you have steam powered presses. It's not until the 1880s or 1890s that you have these massive factory size printing plants that are producing hundreds of thousands of copies. And that's when you really have the birth of advertising in newspapers and magazines. And you start having cheap, mass-produced magazines that have full color covers and, advertising inside the magazines by the 1890s, early 1900s. So when we say mass communications, it's also kind of the birth of mass communications for print, right? Because if before that, you've only got things by these steam powered presses that can maybe make 30,000 copies of something, that's not really mass communication the way we understand it now, where you've got hundreds of thousands of copies of a cheap newspaper or affordable magazine. let alone millions of copies, right? So all of this is what I mean by when I say 1915, you've got this new technology and the birth of mass communication, okay? Now, why is the next kind of point on this slide concerns about media effects? How are these two things related?
At first glance, what I thought of when I read that was just how media educates people in one way or another. So the possible effect of media effect would be people forming opinions about the war. So just making sure that people kind of have that positive outlook on war that was more cultivated in the Second World War, possibly.
Actually, media effects is a specific term, Noah, and it refers to
Never
the
mind.
power of media.
I'm sorry.
The power of media,
Uh-huh.
like how powerful media is.
Propaganda being like one subset of that, I suppose, then.
Well, like how effective is propaganda? Okay. Why would that be a major concern? Is that a major concern now? Like in today's, and how does it relate now to the little robot icon to the left of that, when you think about now? Like when we think about how powerful is propaganda now, what do we immediately think of in terms of technology now?
Social media?
Yeah, like how many of you guys saw The Social Dilemma? Did you see that on Netflix?
Oh, is that the documentary about social media? And okay, yeah, I didn't yet, but my dad saw it and he said he immediately went and turned off all his social media notifications. Is that the same one?
Yeah.
Okay,
Luke, what were
yeah.
you gonna say about it?
Yeah, I haven't watched it yet because people do crazy stuff after they watch it.
Well,
I have,
5 or
That's powerful.
what?
If people do crazy stuff after watching it, that means it's powerful.
Well, I mean, put it this way: your father shut off all of his social media notifications and turned. He got so freaked out, right? Which is arguably part of the power of media itself, right? Your dad watched this thing, and boom, it immediately changed his behavior. He had a completely different view of something that he was doing every day from watching one video. That's not the power of social media. That's the power of what's being invented here, right? That's the power of a film. So that was my question about how are these two things related? How is new technology related to concern about the power of media? Do you guys see the connection? What do you think people were thinking in 1915 if radio is brand new? Like there had never been such a thing as like a broadcast.
They're probably thinking, well, people are definitely going to use this for good and for accurate news portrayal. So they
During World
probably
War
took
I,
it
you
more
think they're
for,
thinking that?
because that's how people treat Twitter now. Any new thing people, well, except for the cynics, a lot of people are going to think, oh, how convenient this will make journalism, or receiving word from people or communication. How convenient will this be? How much good will this be used for?
Yeah,
Which is that is part of the power of new technology, is people's belief in it.
right. And that's a good point. Now think about that with the internet. When you're thinking about the internet being invented in the 90s, have you ever heard about the way people used to talk about the internet?
It was like the World Wide Web and the new frontier of knowledge. It was just like viewed as this new ability for people to have in terms of acquiring knowledge and sharing it, right?
Right, and everybody was going to be free. It was going to unleash information and unleash knowledge, and you weren't going to be chained to newspapers, and we were going to be able to talk back, right, to to all the stuff that was coming in, right? Are people that sunny about social media? Like, have any of you guys, Noe, Luna, did you guys watch The Social Dilemma?
I did.
I didn't, because I thought it was the Facebook movie. So I got kind of excited, but then I realized it was a documentary. So I need to see that because I saw the Facebook movie. So
So the next item on my list was going to be of things that I probably am not going to be able to cover by the end of the semester, was as an assignment to ask you guys to watch the social media, but to watch it more critically after we'd had the conversation we're having today. Okay. But since you guys, I thought everybody had gone and out and seen it already, but I guess not. But I was going to say watch it again. Now watch it more critically. But I think, you know, I'm not going to be able to make it an assignment because I don't want to kill you guys. But when you watch it, you know, definitely try to think about the conversations we've had and hear about the media and see how those conversations apply, and get back to me about it if you want to carry on the conversation. Okay. So then, so there's these concerns about media effects. There was new technology then, right? Just as there is now with the internet and social media now, and with radio and film, and print back then. There were concerns about media and media effects then, and again, I'll get into this. And like I'll get into it in more detail. I'm just gonna kind of summarize these right now. There's a connection between private and private industry and government that's going on. Now, what do I mean by that? The quick answer, just for now, and again, we'll get into it, is that the World War I was a time when governments wanted to get involved. They were at war with each other, and so they wanted to put out what we understand as propaganda, so that they could message people, you know, you've got to sign up for the army, or our side has to win, or the Germans are the enemy. You know, they're the worst people in the world. So there was all this messaging and persuasion that had to go on for the governments to prosecute their wars. But at the same time, what had happened, like say in America, was that America wasn't, you know, you guys may have heard the term superpower, which is what America ended up becoming by the end of World War II, because so much of the world had been destroyed by the Second World War. But America had never had to fight on its own land. America hadn't been reduced to rubble, right? America had gotten out of the Depression as a result of World War II and had all this manufacturing power and all this other stuff. And so by the end of World War II, we were a superpower. We were this massive country that we all know we are today. Back in World War I, we were not a superpower in that sense. We were not, like, we did not throw our weight around globally the way we do now. So when we got involved in a world war, in World War I, the United States didn't have these major, it wasn't, the United States government wasn't this huge thing. It didn't have these huge resources of its own to pull on to say, produce all this propaganda. So it had to turn to private industry. It had to turn to companies, kind of like what happened with the pandemic, right? Remember when everybody was talking about the, you know, calling on private industry to produce respirators and masks and stuff like that when we didn't have that stuff? Well, this is what happened in World War I, and then it happened kind of again in World War II. But when it came to propaganda, the government had to turn to private industry and say, help us out. You guys need to make the messages to get people, you know, engaged in the war, to get, you know, Americans pro-America and anti-German or whatever else. And so this was given to the private industries. So as soon as the private industries were given money and focused on this and developed it with all this new media technology of film and radio and all that, you had the birth of what was called public relations, right? And you had the birth, I mean, you already had advertising beginning to develop, but suddenly propaganda and advertising and public relations all blossomed at the same time, because one was just a private industry version of the other. So when I say the connection between private industry and government, what I'm referring to is the fact that the private industry got involved in government propaganda. And then as a result, that helped give birth to the public relations industry and advertising as we know it. So 2 questions here to clarify that a little. What's the difference between propaganda and public relations and or advertising?
Say again, I'm sorry.
What's the difference between propaganda and public relations, say? PR. Based
Well,
on what I just explained, I guess.
PR, it feels like, is more about one's, I mean, it's a reputation too. So PR,
Yeah, you're getting
I-
into the second question, which is what's the difference between PR and advertising?
I was kind of talking myself into the answer that PR is a kind of just a private sector version of propaganda. Is
Exactly.
propaganda, is that it?
Yes. Right. So propaganda, what we usually mean by
Being
the
like a
term-
government thing versus PR being, they both are the same thing. They use the same tools, but one is to protect government, one's to protect the private sector.
yeah, or to persuade people with the, yeah. I mean, and this is just generally, again, how we use the terms, right? Usually when we talk about propaganda, we talk about, if not a state government, then like ISIS might be doing propaganda, right? But it's for political purposes, right? ISIS isn't really, we wouldn't say ISIS is doing PR. We would say ISIS is doing propaganda, you know? And what's the difference between public relations and advertising?
Well, they're definitely both private sector. I'd say advertising is kind of more not contained, but it's like more temporary. It's about a specific thing versus PR is more of an ongoing like reputation kind of.
Yes, that's a good answer. Basically, PR is about getting your reputation of your company and an imprint in everyone's mind of what you're all about and what they should associate with your company. Advertising is like when they're pushing a product, right? Are any of you guys confused about that? Have I thrown too much at you at once? Y'all following me still? So, and then the final thing is that along with the new technology, along with these concerns about how powerful media is, and along with, you know, both the government or the political people getting involved and the private companies getting involved, right? The corporate effort, all of this snowballs and you have this pushback, right? You have people going, whoa, 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 this is getting out of control. Somebody needs to rein this in. Like, I know we have the First Amendment and everything, folks, but damn, you know, this is out of control, right? And so the other parallel is the push for regulation, you know, or self-regulation versus government regulation, right? So first question, explain some of the parallels we face with media today and the problems, you know, we faced back during World War I and the 20s. These are the 4 major things, right? The new technology, the concern about the power of that new technology, the way both state governments and private companies or corporations were using this power and this new technology, and then all the concerns about that adding up to like a push to kind of regulate it. That was all going on then with the introduction of mass media, and it's going on now with what? With the birth of digital media, right? So to get into the details of this, you know, like I said, back then you had the mass media in print, mass media in film, and the birth of radio, okay? Now you have internet, mobile media, your phones, right? Which you didn't have smartphones even, you know, 15 years ago, and social media. So we have another kind of, you know, revolution in technology going on. You know, it's maybe worth pausing for a second to just add one thought before I go any further, which is, to a large extent, maybe despite myself, I've explained everything to you guys as a technological reason why things happen. Like I'm saying, oh, there was this technology that creates radio and the technology that creates film, and therefore all of these things happen because the technology happened. Do you think when you look at QAnon, or you look at, all these conspiracies we've been talking about, or the anti-vaxxer movement, or the crazy stuff that goes on with the election, are you guys all absolutely sure that it's the technology, it's the internet. The internet is to blame for all of this?
Well, it's definitely not every like part of the reason, but like technology is like the mode of communication nowadays, so it's a heavy factor.
Yeah, it is. And it seems like such a powerful argument that it's almost hard to resist, isn't it? I mean, like, how could it be anything else? Like, the internet has changed everything. Like, here we are on Zoom. We can't even meet in class. We're in this totally weird situation.
But I don't think like that type of example would like work because like the pandemic is the reason we had to resort to Zoom. So like there are tools that like based on circumstances we can use, but I don't think like the evolution of technology forces us to like be having a school year like this. Like obviously there's other reasons, but I feel like since we do have some of these outlets, they're available to use and it's just like a lot easier than other forms.
Yeah, and it does underscore that there are other things going on other than technology that that fundamentally change our world, right? It's not all about technology. So I think, you guys I've had you read a lot of stuff by Michael Judson this semester. And I told you guys, I was at a conference with him in 2017 when he gave that video that I assigned you guys that video about fake news, or he gave that lecture on Belgium invades Germany. And I gave my lecture on the study that I had you guys read, which was the history of fake news, right? And I was talking to him during that conference, and I asked him because I knew that he was opposed to this idea that we come up with technological explanations for everything. And I said, how can you not say that all the problems we went through with the last election and with fake news and with Trump getting election were not because of the internet? Like, how can you argue that that isn't true? And he said, well, think about it this way. TV gets invented. TV comes to China. TV comes to America. Does it have the exact same effect in China that it has in America? Like, no, it doesn't, right? Like the effect on China would have been totally different than what we experienced in America with television, right? So I guess just to kind of finish that whole train of thought about all of this, one of the things that I've really realized, and I just would like to hear whether you guys agree or disagree or what your thoughts about this, is that what if we explain the anti-vax movement and the Trump movement and like the anti-vote, the steal the vote thing, how the whole election was rigged and all the conspiracies are going on. What if we say that a lot of the reason why all this is going on is because there's like a class war in America, or there's like the two different Americas, and one part of America feels like the other part owns all the expertise. They seem to think they have all the facts. They seem to think that they own all the media and Hollywood and all the cultural power. And this other side that feels completely disenfranchised by the people that own all the facts and all the expertise and all the power. Maybe a lot of them didn't go to college. They only have high school educations or whatever else. They don't feel part of this club. And they're like, you know what? We're not going to believe your facts anymore. We're not going to believe your stories anymore. You've failed us. We're going to develop our own media, our own set of facts, our own stories to explain all of this. We're not going to listen to you all anymore. Do you guys think that that's what's been going on? Is that equally as powerful an explanation as the technological thing of, oh, this is just because of the internet?
I can kind of see what you're trying to get at, like with the whole like the fact that some people actually believe in some of the conspiracies is because they feel so disenfranchised by just how poorly they've been treated because of their social class, and they think that it's like ah, I don't know what the word is. It's like the government is actively trying to keep them in
Yeah.
a certain way, which is there's like statistics to back up these type of things, but I don't know how to talk about anti-vax. Like I don't know where that came from, so I don't really know how to explain that, but I could kind of see how people would believe in QAnon and how it's might be class related because it's talking about these elite upper class that are trying to basically just work behind the scenes, which is kind of plausible, but at the same time it's really crazy. So it's I don't know.
Do you guys see any kind of similarity with the vaccine thing to what she's talking about? What are the conspiracies about vaccines? What do they accuse people of?
I get autism.
Right, but what do they think's going on?
No. What?
What do they think's going on? What are their conspiracy theories about vaccines?
I don't know. That's the only one that I know.
That they cause that, but there's more to the any of you guys well it's that these are all the pharmaceutical companies, right? And the rich doctors and the capitalism with medicine, right? The for-profit medical industry. And that the pandemic is a plandemic. It was all a plan. Maybe some people believe that it was a plan to get rid of Trump, to get Trump knocked out of office. Or he said that himself, right? You watch, all the restrictions will go away as soon as they get me out of office. Everything's going to be fine.
See, that sounds really familiar to the just say a whole bunch of random stuff until there's no real reality.
Right, but it is playing on something specific, which is people's distrust of experts and those in power and the major drug companies and things like and the government that's telling you to wear a mask or whatever, right?
But there's like real world issues with big pharma that you can sort of see how people believe in some of these conspiracies because wasn't there this some sort of opioid epidemic which basically crippled this entire state, and it was all due to like a big pharma distributing all these opiates to this one state at this ridiculous amount that no one bothered regulating. So it, it's
That's
like they,
right.
yeah.
Yeah, it's a huge scandal, a huge horrible thing that they were basically pushing, they were prescribing this, addictive opioids. And it was this enormous business, and now there's all these lawsuits and all these consequences, and there's been all these investigations into it. So it's a good point. All right. So anyway, so these are the overall parallels, and that was that was kind of a side road just to say that I'm giving you very much a technological explanation, but this is just one explanation, and you guys should keep that in mind, right? But then in terms of that, this is where I explain. So this is what those. Remember, I was telling you guys about those major printing presses that they had invented by the 1890s or 1880s. This is what those looked like. And you remember what the pictures of the old hand printed presses look like? Let me pull that up. So this was like the kind of color cartoons that you had by the 1890s. And by the 1920s, you had tabloid newspapers like these. So this is kind of where I'm saying that even in print, mass media is just being born during this time. Let me pull up like a so something like this. this is what had existed, you know, by 1815. By 1915, you had, you know, you had this massive thing producing hundreds of thousands of copies of it. So, okay, now with radio, let me just see, you know, and I know you guys are not like history experts. Does anyone have any idea of where radio was at by 1915? So it was like where it's at in these pictures. People are just, it's almost like still a hobby. People don't have radios yet. Okay. I mean, there are barely cars. There are like Model Ts. There certainly aren't cars in the radios in cars until the 1950s. But there aren't even radios at home except, and you see this middle picture where somebody's like, hey, check out my handset radio. I mean, it's really at that primitive label. And in fact, as I say here, in the Radio Act of 1912, as soon as this technology started to come online, the government stepped in and said, you can't broadcast at all. We're going to need these frequencies for military. So up until around 1920, you know, up through the World War I, the government wasn't allowing anyone to really broadcast to any degree over the radio. By the 20s, this is allowed, but what we recognize as like commercial radio, where you have, you know, first of all, you don't have FM radio until the 50s either. But what we recognize as commercial radio, where you have advertising on there, and you know they're just playing stuff like all the time. You don't really have that by the 20s. What you have is suddenly it's like the Wild West, where you get on a radio dial and you've got people broadcasting. Like there are people broadcasting, like somebody might own a dry cleaning shop, but in the back of their shop, they've got like an antenna, and they're maybe a Polish family with a dry cleaning shop. And so they're playing, you know, old records of polka dances and broadcasting that to whoever can hear it. And then next door, there's some other guy with a pizza place or something broadcasting. So it's like, it's kind of chaos, right? And this is what's happening in the 20s. It's like it's all over the place. And what happens is that, you know, they eventually rein this in, and I'll get into that with the regulation. Okay? But in film, which is the next slide, so in 1895, you have the first like exhibitions of film, okay? And the Lumiere brothers were like, Luke, have you learned any of this history of film yet? Or you may not even.
Yeah, we learned about the Lumiere brothers.
Okay. So do you know what was their first projectors like? You know about those?
I mean, I could go through my notes. I really don't know off the top of my head.
They just were simply they use the same like piece of technology, like the same piece of equipment as the camera. They use it as their projector, and they were some of the first to show. The Lumiere brothers were in France, and they were some of the first to show films to groups. And they would say, hey, everybody, let's get together and we're going to show you a film. And they would show these really quick, like the whole program was 20 minutes long, but this was probably, it was 10 short films. So each film was just maybe a minute or two, okay? And then, Luke, do you know what a Nickelodeon is? Did you learn about that?
I don't think so.
So, okay, so by
Wasn't sorry, a Nickelodeon, wasn't that the like early theater that you used a nickel to view something in?
Yeah, it was before you had movie theaters. What you had, like, and you had a lot of these started in like poor areas where it was a lot of immigrants, like in the city, and it was densely packed and it was looked down upon. Like they actually padlocked in New York City. A lot of them were in Jewish neighborhoods, and they actually padlocked them because they accused them of being dens of vice and crime or whatever. What they were was instead of movie theaters, you would go in and there were a bunch of machines and you would drop a nickel in and you would hand crank it and you would watch a 2 or 3 minute movie. And so this was also the very beginning of trying to figure out how do you splice together pieces of film to tell a story. You know, can I do it in a 2 or 3 minute thing? Okay. By 1912 or so, you have a couple things going on. For one thing, by around this time, you start having the first movie theaters opening up, because as soon as they start cracking down on the Nickelodeon theaters and saying, "Oh, these are dirty, disgusting places," these guys who own them were smart businessmen, and so rather than fighting the government about this, they were like, you know what? Okay, we're going to open these up as nice movie theaters. We're going to make them look nice. We're going to make them welcoming to wealthier, nicer people, so that wealthy people and richer people will come in. And this was kind of the birth of movie theaters. And at the same time, there had been kind of this domination, this monopoly of movies in New York, because the same people who own the equipment for the films also owned all the rights to the film and to everything else. So to kind of get away from all that, a bunch of, it was mostly Jewish immigrants, moved out to this totally empty place in the Southern California desert called Hollywood. And that is when in 1912 they start Hollywood. They realize, oh, well, we, you know, they're coming from the East Coast. They're realizing we can film all year here because the weather's nice, right? And it's sunny, and there's nobody, there's no, you know, Thomas Edison to be bullying us and pushing us around. We can, you know, have our own cameras and our own film and, you know, start producing movies. So all this is born around 1912 to 1915. That's when you have this first major, one of the very first major epic films, which is like a lengthy feature film, which unfortunately was a totally racist movie called Birth of a Nation, which is infamous and is important, you know, that now we're talking about crossing the line, and well, we're really into propaganda, right? And it's propaganda of racism. Um, and then there's another major moment, which is the birth of the first sound movie. So this is all silent films, but by 1915 to 1920, you start having Hollywood movie stars. You start having what's called the studio system, where they basically create a production line for movies so that they're producing movies like you would produce tin cans out of a factory, where they've got every movie moving through a production line, where first it gets written, then it goes to, you know, the shooting with the director, then it goes into production where they edit it and cut it down, and then it goes into release. So it's this factory system. They've developed that by about 1920, and then they don't. But so they're starting to have Hollywood by around 1920, and Hollywood movie stars and celebrity, but you don't have the first talking picture until 1927. And so the early talkie films, like around 1930, are called talkies. Okay, but so World War One, you're really seeing movies getting born, right? You're seeing the first feature films getting made, and people are starting to see them in movie theaters, and you're starting to hear about this brand new phenomenon called the Hollywood cinema. Okay? Now, all of this comes together, where when a world war starts, the governments, what do you think the governments are saying when you start to have this massive things where every government is pouring everything into, you know, a war effort? How do you think they're looking at this media? If you were president, or if you were the Kaiser in Germany, what would your first thoughts be about these brand new things like radio, film, you know, mass production of newsprint? You're in a war, right? It's not just like a half-hearted thing. You've got to win that war, or your country's going to get destroyed. So how would you be thinking about these?
Figure it out quickly and figure out how it can be useful to you.
Yeah. Do you think that they thought, oh, it's just movies? What difference does that make?
I mean, yeah, a ton of early films were about heavily pressing issues at the time.
Yeah. Well, why? I mean, they're just movies. I mean, why would
They were never just movies
why would governments bother to get involved in things like movies? or radio?
because they know that it's the next frontier and they need to be able to control that in such a crazy time that is a war.
And they can spark controversy.
Do you think that they had the same view of the power of this technology that we have now?
I'd say yeah. I mean, we've always tried to make the most of new technologies as much as we can. That's just kind of human nature, but it's also just the nature of wanting progress. Going back to things like,
All you
just
guys,
horses can travel quickly. They can travel quicker than we can. Let's use them for communication and travel and things like that. We innovate.
how many of you guys agree with Noah that they would have seen movies and radios and newsprint the same way we see it now? How many? Did any of you guys disagree? What do you think?
I mean,
Lee?
it's hard to say because we have so much different stuff nowadays.
All right. Well, how many of you guys are surprised at this story? So, back when the Lumiere brothers are doing their thing, right? Where is it? The 1895 first film exhibition. You guys remember my story about they show a film of a train coming down the track towards the audience? Just a film of a train, and at the beginning of it's just a 30-second film clip of a train coming down the track towards the audience. Right? Do you guys, did I tell you this story to you guys? Do you remember it?
Yeah,
Yeah, and
scared, right?
What?
they ran out of the theater, right? Because they thought the train was actually coming towards them.
Yeah. So what does that story tell you about the way they looked at media differently than the way we look at it now?
Well, I think the difference between that is that that kind of media had never been seen before, so it was understandable that people were scared because they didn't know whether that was a real trainer or if that was just like an image shown to them. So I think they had a more innocence back then. They didn't really know an Amber, but I think now it's pretty easy to point out like different like areas where people might spark like different reactions and outcomes.
So in terms of media power, if you were going to rate that on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being really weak power and 10 being really powerful, that's pretty powerful, right? That they're jumping out of their out of their seats to get out of the way of the train.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, they were like actually scared of it.
Yeah. And remember my story about Orson Welles and the War of the Worlds? Are all you guys familiar with that? 'Cause I know, some of you guys have been around for the lectures and some haven't. Do you guys know that story of War of the Worlds? Orson Welles with his radio broadcast and what is it, Halloween night, 1938?
Oh yeah, and he broadcasted as if something were actually happening and it wasn't. And the story is that people were freaked out and they thought that there was actually some crazy otherworldly event happening, but like that was massively overblown and people didn't really think it was real.
Yeah,
Most people didn't think it was real, but that's a good story, so we stick to it.
right. And people believed that at the time, right? When all the newspapers came out and said, "Oh, there had been this mass panic because of an alien invasion," nobody doubted that, right? Because there was a shared understanding that radio is that powerful. Do you guys get where I'm going with all this? If we talk about, how did your dad react when he saw The Social Dilemma? He immediately went and shot off all of his notifications on his social media, right?
He's also just a generally productive person by nature, but I that had a major hand in it.
Right, but it's like that flipped a switch in him, right? I mean, for sure, which tells you one thing about maybe the real power of something like movies. Like in 1895, it got people to jump out of their seats because they thought a train was coming. In 2020, it's enough to make your dad get up and do something differently right away, right? So maybe there's something to that about the real innate power of film, right? But also, what do you think they were telling him about the power of social media in that documentary? Having not even seen it yourself. I mean, Noah, you've seen it, right?
His broadcast?
You've seen The Social Dilemma, haven't you?
Oh yeah, I have. Sorry.
And what would you say their message is about social media?
Just that they never, well, the creators of it never realized just how like powerful it would become. They saw the good things it could do, like bring people back together or like make everyone connected with one another, but they never realized, I guess, the impact it would have, like the whole genocide it caused in that one country.
But would you say that now they realize it's got a little bit of power, but not that much? Would you say that that was how they come off?
Yeah, they didn't really outright say, like they were very like skirting around the whole, like the impact it actually had, but it was kind of left unsaid that social media was pretty powerful right now.
Like maybe totally powerful? Like it can control your mind, powerful?
Yeah, like they even put statistics about suicide rates amongst teens and stuff, so I'd say it was pretty leading towards that statement, pretty
Yeah,
powerful.
they basically don't say anything about the limits of that power, right? So do you guys see the connection? We have new technology then, we have new technology now. And so to go back to this initial slide of what's the first question, what are the parallels? There's major new technology. There's a sense that this new technology is incredibly, incredibly powerful, right? We've talked about, so do you guys, are you guys following me here? As soon as this new technology comes on, what we're really focused on is how powerful it is, the idea that it's all powerful, right? There isn't much of a sense of stepping back and going, whoa, 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 there are limits to the power, right? And so in World War I, I say the reaction to this was to try and grab hold of this and to use it to create these massive propaganda campaigns. And then this is a comment from you, if you guys know Borat, the comedian, Sacha Baron Cohen, this is something he said about the power of social media now. He says, all this hate and violence is being facilitated by a handful of internet companies that amount to the greatest propaganda machine in history. If you pay them, Facebook will run any political ad, even if it's a lie, and they'll even help you micro-target. What does micro-target mean in the internet world?
At least in terms of advertisements, it's about targeting for a very specific demographic that already show an interest in X advertisement or political thing. So you're feeding into their beliefs based on an algorithm collected about them.
Right, and the idea is that that the people who run Facebook know all of these things, know an unprecedented amount of information about all of us that they never knew before, right? And that they can slice and dice that. They know what TV shows you watch. They've got through the computers in your car. They know where you go when you run your errands, what your favorite stores are, what your favorite products are, what your favorite music is, everything about you, who your friends are, right? And so they can use all that through like artificial intelligence and all these other algorithms to slice and dice and target messaging based on who you actually are, right? And so he says, under this twisted, they'll even help you micro target those lies to their users for maximum effect. Under this twisted logic, if Facebook was around in the 1930s, it would have allowed Hitler to run 30 seconds ads on his solution to the Jewish problem. As one headline put it, just think of what Goebbels could have done with Facebook. So this is a sense of like how given new technology and given these views of how powerful that technology is, how it was used then and how it's used now, right? And part of the thing is, when Facebook developed all these tools, why did they develop them? Why did they first develop them? Did they develop them for the Trump campaign? You guys watch the Facebook dilemma, right? Well, I don't know if that's, you watch part 2. That isn't as clear for me. Luna, do
I
you know
remember
why?
we had to see both of them.
Yeah.
I think that's definitely when it started. Like during the time of the first election, for Trump.
Not for Facebook. When did Facebook first start developing all these technologies?
Wasn't it when there was that issue going on in the Middle East?
Well, that became part of it, but they developed all this to go public as a company, and they developed all of this for their advertisers, for the private sector, right? These were commercial advertising. And then what happened? Then governments came in and said, "Hey, wow, we can use this. We can use this in the Middle East, right? We can use this in," or political actors in the Middle East got online to communicate with each other. But then governments started to get online and use it, or political campaigns, politicians like the Trump campaign started using it, right? So it jumped from people selling products and them gathering information to know what products to push on us to political messages. So that's the connection between then and now, right? And then finally, just to kind of reiterate this, some of this is done for the purpose of selling you a message. Some of it is just done to disorient you, right? So that you're sort of paralyzed, or so you're powerless. So the people in power can continue to pursue their agenda by rendering huge groups of the population just by sidelining them, divide and conquer, right? And we've looked at examples of that, right? Like with the Hunter Biden thing and everything else. Okay, so then the next thing is, okay, well then this is media effects, the connection between private government and industry. So I've been jumping ahead a little bit, but what were some of the concerns about the power of media or media effects then, and what are some now?
Real quick, Professor. So the parallels 2, 3, and 4 each correlate to like one of the other questions as well, or
Yeah,
because this is question number 2.
well, okay, so if we go back to the original thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Question number 2 is explain some of the parallels. So that's going to be right here. Okay, but
Can
then
you go back to that other slide first? Some of the parallels. Okay, I see. So
then the next
media
question,
effects being an answer to A and also being the topic of B.
yes,
Gotcha. Cool. Thank you.
yeah. And so then to kind of get into that, people started to question, after World War I, where 200,000 people died, they start to question, how powerful is this stuff? Like to what extent were we all snookered or hustled into this horrible war where all these Americans died? What the hell did we fight about anyway? I mean, when you guys think back on World War I, does anyone know why? Does anyone remember why America got involved in World War I? So people started.
Lusitania was bombed.
What?
I think. Wasn't like the Lusitania bombed?
It was, but as opposed to like the war against slavery, the Civil War, or when we think about World War II, when you think about World War I, where 200,000 Americans died, it's not very clear what that was all about, right? In memory. And so you're right. you're right, technically, Luke, but and what happened was that there were continued attacks by the German on American submarines. But in the aftermath of the war, when Americans were looking back, a lot of them were very suspicious, and they felt like this was maybe all the result of propaganda. And so, at that point, this guy named Harold Laswell started to study media. And he ended up coming up with this theory that if you develop these myths that people buy into and connect them to these symbols, that would be a really effective way of pushing propaganda. Okay. And then they started, there were tactics that were being involved. By the 1930s, people started developing these tactics like the big lie, which we talked about, which was that you sell a big myth to the people in your country and you convince them of it. Right. And I already talked about this, but this was the example of, in terms of the power of media effects, Orson Welles, his radio broadcast, and fake news. And then just to kind of finish this up, by the Second World War, there was this idea that looking back, everybody had been so convinced that the media was really powerful, but that actually there hadn't been enough discussion about the limits of the power. And so this new group of people came in when World War II was about to start, and the American government was looking at who do we want to run the major propaganda effort for the country. This group of media scholars came in and said, well, there's all these people that just believe the media controlled everything, but we have a much more scientific way of studying the power of media. We're going to do it through science, and we're going to actually have quantitative data that measures the power of media. And so they dismissed all of the people, the new scientists who were coming out and saying, let us control the new propaganda efforts for World War II. They dismissed all the people that were coming before them by saying, these people believed in a magic bullet theory or a hypodermic needle theory. These people believed that media was just all powerful and just controlled people's minds. But we don't believe that. We believe in scientific research about it. Now, the thing is that, arguably the people that came before, like Walter Lippmann and Harold Laswell, actually had much more sophisticated ideas about, media than that. But the way that the people who wanted all the funding for, the propaganda for World War II, the way that they kind of portrayed all of the researchers and professors who had come before them was to say, oh, those guys believed in this crazy hypodermic needle theory, kind of like the way I'm criticizing The Social Dilemma, right? I'm saying that film is all about how all powerful the media is, but it doesn't take a skeptical look and say, well, how powerful is it really? Arguably the more important question is not just, is it all powerful or is it not powerful at all, but how powerful is it? Right? You guys following me? What?
Yeah.
Okay, so then, and the final point I wanted to make about all this was then they in the 60s they did an experiment with this Bobo doll where they showed kids violent movies and then they put them in a room with one of those big clown dolls. You see the doll there, and the kids were beating the hell out of the doll. And so they said, this is proof that media makes you violent. So we need to control the violence in the media. Any of you guys see a problem with those kind of experiments?
Is it causation is not correlation, or that one lesson we did? It
Yeah.
was about the bear patrol thing.
Yeah, there were issues like that with the study. And it's been, the more they've studied it, the more they've realized, the relationship between watching violence on TV and actually being violent are, is difficult to discern. Okay. So, today we're wrestling with, you know, how powerful is social media? Is it a threat to democracy? I mean, these are a lot of things we've talked about all semester. There's this idea that social media creates this rage machine, that the algorithms, this is another quote from Sacha Baron Cohen, the algorithms, these platforms, hold on. Noah's getting back in. How do I, give me a second. Was he able to join? Oh. I know it.
All right, thanks.
So, okay, so actually this is running a little long, so I'm gonna try and wrap this up, but I think I've gotten through some of the main stuff. We can talk about the rest of this next week when you guys are answering these questions. But I was just saying, you know, in terms of this question of the power of the media, what people are saying about it now was, we talked about filter bubbles, right? The idea that everybody's in their own little world with media. We've talked to, there's also this idea that the algorithms themselves like really prey on our levels of engagement. So when they find something that gets us angry or gets us worked up, they want to get us more and more and more engaged so that we stay longer on their app more and more. And so they keep feeding us stuff. They have algorithms that keep feeding us stuff that get us angrier and angrier or more emotional about what we say, right? And so to the point where, this is an interesting quote from this guy. He says, what would happen to American democracy if one day in the early 20th century, a technology appeared that over the course of a decade changed fundamental parameters of social and political life? What if this technology greatly increased the amount of mutual animosity and the speed with which outrage spreads? Might we witness the political equivalent of buildings collapsing, birds falling from the sky, and the earth moving closer to the sun? So there's this idea of like, God, you know, this may be just changing the whole nature of reality for us, right? And then part of that, you know, to circle back on this idea of micro-targeting is, you know, and this is a quote from the guy, Brad Parscale, who was, until he got arrested for getting into an altercation with the police, he was running Trump's political campaign, election campaign. Did you guys know about that? The guy running Trump's election campaign. I think he got fired first, but then this was like just a couple months ago. Then he had this drunken incident where he apparently pulled a gun on his wife, and then the police showed up, and you can watch the video. They end up tackling him to the ground. And so he's had a bit of an issue, but this is him being quoted back in 2016. He said, what I recognized was the simple process of marketing. I needed to find the right people in the right places and show the right message. Micro-targeting allows you to do is say, well, these people are most likely to show up to vote, and these are the right audiences we need to show up. The numbers were showing in the consumer side that people were spending more and more hours of their day consuming Facebook content. So if you have any best place to show your content, it would be there. It was a place where their eyes were. That's where they were reading their local newspapers and doing things. And so we could hear our message injected inside that stream. And that was a stream which was controlling the eyeballs of most places that we wanted to win. And Sacha Baron Cohen says, if you pay them, we will run any political ad, even if it's a lie. Right? So all this is going on. In the summary slide that I have here, any of you guys recognize this picture?
Wizard
It's
of Oz.
from the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, why am I putting that up?
He was a liar.
Well, yeah, he's a liar. And what happens in this moment in the movie?
They kind of pull
The-
the thread and
The
see
dog. Yeah.
He
that
got caught.
it's all about perception.
Yeah, do you guys see the analogy with media that's in that movie? So he's pulling all the strings and making the whole show go on, right? And that's a metaphor or that's a representation of the media, right? And so the pulling back the curtain is when we say, wait a minute, how does it operate and how powerful it is? And so what I would argue is, you know, what does the science tell us? How sound is the science? Do we really have any idea? How much does it matter if media really is powerful versus how much we're convinced it's powerful, right? So if all the world leaders in World War I or World War II were convinced that media could control people's minds, then they did a lot with media to use it that way, right? So to some extent, it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. All right, so then these are now the questions that where you have your choice, okay? And this is, should I go through these quickly, or do you guys want to wrap up and do this on the next occasion, like next week? Luna, how are you feeling?
This is on La Lima, right?
Well, I'll post this. I mean, the PowerPoint is online.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the PowerPoint's
'cause-
on there already. I feel like maybe we should pick up next week.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I would point you guys to, and you can tell me if it's self-explanatory or how much time I need to spend on it, is this idea of pragmatic objectivity. And it's simply the idea that back in, say, the 1920s, we thought facts, ethics, and opinion and analysis were all, that facts were separate from all of these things. And it's turning out that that may not really be true, right? That we understand facts through a combination of analysis, opinion, and ethics, right? And so pragmatic objectivity would be, how do we come up with a version of objectivity where we understand that these things, you can't simply separate out opinion or separate out right and wrong from being objective. We have to have an idea of objective that involves understanding what's right and wrong. Like if a news report, like you'll see this now, if you look on a New York Times story, they don't necessarily shy away from a moral judgment. And they don't necessarily shy away from interpretation or analysis in a news story. You guys see what I'm saying? So it's a question of, the idea of pragmatic objectivity is that you can't simply do this. You have to recognize that in the real world, the lines are blurry and they're more like this. Okay. And, and then I expand on that, a little bit from there, but we can pick that up next week. Okay. But that's one of the options for the questions that you can answer, because if you go back and look, the last two questions are, how do you understand objectivity? What concerns of scholars raised about the traditional notion of objectivity, and what do you think? And then the fourth question is, explain the principles of pragmatic objectivity. And what I'm saying is, the principle is that you can't simply separate facts from opinion, or facts from interpretation, or facts from an ethics of right and wrong. Okay, that these things are on some level inseparable, even in a news story, that they're going to keep creeping in. And so maybe the best way to try and be objective is to acknowledge that you can't simply separate those. So do you guys have any questions before we wrap up today? Was there anything you really didn't understand? Do you feel comfortable about answering these questions? What do you think, Millie? You have to take yourself off mute.
So is the 20% of the quiz, like the part about propaganda and disinformation, is that going to be short answer, or like just different types of things?
So 1 or 2 paragraphs per question.
Hmm.
Make sure to fully answer the question though. Answer the first 2 questions, be specific and concrete. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Uh-huh. We went through a lot of material today. Are you guys, you've got this video to go back to, right? To refresh your memory. Did I go through it in an organized enough way? I realize that it gets pretty deep with some of this, but Were you able to kind of follow?
And then for the rest of the exam, are we also going to be reviewing like the multiple choice part of it?
Yeah, so what we can do is a couple things, Noah. It's not going to be multiple choice on this one at all. But what we can do is, as soon as I get it up there, I'm going to really try to have it up there by Tuesday. Okay. It's just there's a lot of work that I got to do to get a quality exam to you guys. But I'm going to try and have it by Tuesday. So the plan is, if I can't have it by Tuesday, we'll go over the rest of these answers, and you guys can try and the sooner you can start drafting these answers, the sooner it'll be helpful when we go over it together. Okay. And then Thursday we can do another Zoom session, and for that matter, the exam week, if you guys are available for say 2 p.m. the week of exam week, we can do another Zoom session and we can pick up from there. Okay, and the exam will be due. It'll be a take-home exam, so the exam will be due. I think I'll make it due by the end of the day, Thursday night of what day is that? That is,
That's, I believe, the 17th.
yes, which, it's going to be a quick turnaround for me to grade everything because my grades are due the 22nd, but that's all right. I can get all of it done by the 22nd. So is there anything about any of this subject matter that it's all pretty straightforward, I think, right? I mean, it's a lot, but you guys kind of understand where things were back then. I mean, what we didn't get into, and we'll do next week when we talk about it, is this idea of self-regulation in the media. And so I show a timeline for that with news media, and then with radio, and then with film. And my point is, what's going on now with that? And to help with this, I may put up, I was just listening to a podcast with Kara Swisher, who covers social media for the New York Times. And what she was saying was, and you guys have all seen this, is over the course of us just being together, Twitter and Facebook and YouTube have really come around. Like, they are definitely the cops on the beat now. Like, you cannot find all of these anti-vaxxer and and QAnon conspiracy theory stuff. They have scrubbed this stuff off of YouTube, and they're being pretty vigilant about keeping it off. There's a problem with that, though. Can you guys imagine what the problem with that is? Like, how well educated do you think Mark Zuckerberg is?
Not.
Right. Who do you think's running their self-regulation? Him, right? So, I mean, there are other people carrying out the policies, but what do you think a guy like Mark Zuckerberg, he did go to Harvard, but he didn't graduate, right? He launched Facebook before he graduated. So he's got like an undergraduate education at best. Why would that be a problem in terms of like what Facebook is now having to deal with? I mean, I've almost given you guys, especially when I get into this kind of stuff, this gets pretty sophisticated, right? In terms of what I'm asking you guys to understand about just philosophy, right? About where we draw the lines and how we draw them, about what is permitted to say and what isn't. So if Mark Zuckerberg just says, well, I can allow everything because I believe in the First Amendment, that's a problem, right? Because there's a difference between what the government can do by law and what, as a responsible company, Facebook is expected to do to self-regulate, right? Like, ideally, you don't want the government stepping in because they have to worry about the First Amendment. But Facebook can recognize its responsibilities and can come in with its own rules, right? But then you have to have somebody who's well educated enough and sophisticated enough to have like reasons. I mean, it's one thing to just say, oh, I'm going to kill everything that has to do with QAnon, right? Or I'm going to kill everything that's anti-vax. But that's not a philosophy, right? That's not a policy. That's like whack-a-mole. And so I would just suggest to you guys, and maybe I'll put up the podcast that Kara Swisher does, because she basically explains what I'm explaining here. But that, you know, that's the problem. These people are now drawing all these lines and they're regulating, but how do they know how do they know what they're doing? And so what do you guys have any ideas or thoughts about that at this point? So
Well,
this,
most of these issues go into censorship, right? Like that's what he keeps arguing. Like he doesn't have the authority to do any of this, so he just kind of leaves it. Like that's why it's an ongoing problem. He doesn't know how to fix it.
right. And so that's why I'm asking you guys these last couple of questions. I'm framing it to keep it a bit narrow in terms of objectivity, because part of the assumption I'm making here is that it's not just the social media platforms that have to worry about self-regulating, right? It's also MSNBC and CNN and Fox and all of them. They have to look at what are our standards for journalism? What are our standards for news? So, I mean, it's not as if the questions are different. Like that Facebook has a different question about what is news, what is real journalism, what is real information, what's not, that a news organization has, right? They may have different missions as companies, but you know, at the end of the day, Facebook is going to have to judge what they consider journalism or real news and what they don't, and news organizations are going to have to judge that. So I'm just kind of trying to keep the question narrow around the issue of objectivity, because that was an initial standard that in the, you know, in the 1920s, when these people, when these same concerns got brought up, right, and these people started trying to regulate the news industry, that's when the word objectivity got introduced. It wasn't a word before all of this stuff happened with propaganda and mass media and the concerns about the news getting out of control, that these people said, we need objectivity. And so what happens now? Do we say that's a 100-year-old concept? It's useless to us now. Do we leave it the way it is and call it fine? Well, if we do that, why do we still having all these problems? You know, or do we find a way, do we chuck it out, or do we find a way to preserve it and reinvent it? And if we reinvent it, what are your ideas about how we reinvent it? And would that work for, you know, Facebook? As you know, would some definition work as well for Facebook as it would work for the New York Times and for their reporters? Right. I don't ask you all of that here, but I try to keep these questions narrow to just let you tackle one part of it. But well, no, I do. I say, question number 2, what was proposed in the 20s for self-regulation? Explain the strengths and weaknesses and offer your own suggestions for social media and news sites. And then these questions are more specific about that. So you don't have to go with this one. You can just stay more focused on, because you've got a choice with these. Choose 2 to answer these 4. Okay. So anyway, let's stop there. You know, how are you feeling, Luna? Overwhelmed or okay, or what are your thoughts?
I'm fine.
What'd you say?
I'm good.
You're good, Luke? You there, Luke?
Yeah, I'm sorry. What was the question?
How are you? I said we're about to wrap up. How are you feeling? Are you feeling overwhelmed, or, you know, how do you feel about the essay questions?
Pretty good. I just think that going over this next week, I'll feel better.
Yeah. So what I'll try and do is get the exam up by Tuesday. I just can't promise it. But if we can do that, then we can do the I'm vain type of deconstruction stuff on Tuesday. And then that would give you more time to maybe draft a couple of these paragraphs so that you're more ready. But try to have, as best you can, some of this stuff, like at least notes about it, to read off and share by next Tuesday. Sound good? Okay. All right. I'll see you guys. Good luck this weekend. Reach out to me if you have any questions. It's, I'm asking you to do a couple of different things for the weekend. And I will see you guys Tuesday. All right.
Thank you, Dr.
Bye,
G.
Dr. G.
Bye.